All right, everybody. All right, let's see. We do have the right audio selected. Yeah. All right. Welcome back to another reading hour. This will be the reading hour for August 22nd, 2025. So let's get right into it. Getting back into the Gladio book. So this next section here is scare tactics. So where we last left off, let's see. I'll read the last paragraph just to catch you up a little bit. He had dropped dead immediately before his scheduled interrogation by Italian detectives. No autopsy was conducted. So that's about Santovito. Um, The Stybum executive was discovered on the floor of his cell in the. Oh no, sorry, I skipped the sentence. In 1983, the same strange jailhouse fate befell Henry Arson. So both these guys, Santo Vito and this guy Henry Arson, uh, the Stybum executive was discovered on the floor of his cell in the prison of San Vittore. His eyes were bulging from the sockets, his lips bright purple, and his skin was an ashen shade of gray. No autopsy was conducted. His jailers merely announced that he had died of a heart attack. So yeah, now we're on to scare tactics, as if that kind of thing wasn't scary enough. After the mysterious deaths of Arson and Santovito, Palermo relocated to Sicily. So this guy's last name is Palermo. And then the Palermo is also a region in Italy. I can't remember his first name in here, but he's like a banker of some kind, one of these mobbed up bankers. So Palermo moved to Sicily in order to continue his probe into the relationship of the Sicilian mafia. Or is this okay? Maybe Palermo was the investigator. I guess I'm misremembering. Sorry. So he moved to Sicily in order to continue his probe into the relationship of the Sicilian mafia to the Arms for Drugs network. Shortly after opening his office within the House of Justice in Trapani, a car loaded with TNT exploded along the side of the highway through Pizzalungo. It was set to detonate just as the judge passed by, traveling from his house in Bonaggia to Trapani in an armored Fiat 132. The explosion toppled the car, severely injuring Palermo and several of his bodyguards. The blast also blew apart a Volkswagen Sirocco, killing Barbara Rizzo Asta, 30, and her twin sons. Oof. In the wake of this accident, Palermo resigned from the judiciary. Okay, he was a judge. My bad, you guys. So yeah, they effectively scared him enough that he's like, yeah, I'm just not even going to be a judge anymore. I'm just going to retire. Despite his retirement, Palermo continued to pore over the confiscated documents from Stybum, looking for missing clues that might explain the creation of the shipping company that specialized in arms and drugs and the mysterious deaths of those who could provide telling details about its operation. He noticed that the initials TGS, signifying a major figure in the arms and drugs network, kept appearing again and again. Years later, the judge finally realized that the recurring initials stood for Theodore G. Shackley, the former deputy director of the CIA who had been in charge of all covert operations. Wild. Pretty damning stuff. Think anything happened to Shackley? Think he was ever like convicted in some kind of court for all this drug trafficking he was involved in or creating? I'm gonna guess not. Doesn't that tell me how many people join anymore? Oh well. Yeah, I'm going to have to switch over to a new streaming software, you guys, by the way. So if there's like a little hiccup in there when I do that, or if there's like a gap in some streams, that'll be why. Sorry. New undertakings is the next section here. After the raid on Stybum, the CIA created new shipping companies to perpetuate the drugs for arms trade. Alavain and Alavain International were set up in Scotland and Israel by Terence Charles Byrne, an American arms dealer, at the request of CIA Director William Casey. One of the first shipments from these firms was made to the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran as part of the October Surprise Promise. The shipment contained long-range artillery as well as electronics that the mullah used in his war against Iraq. Another shipment contained 3 large flasks of radioactive cesium, which were sent to Denmark and from there exported to Portugal and onward via Cyprus and Israel to Iran. So, like, quite literally, weapons laundering, moving it from country to country so that you can't track it. I guess, like, crazy stuff. It seems like they wouldn't even need to go through that many circuitous routes. It seems like they usually just go right to the person that they want to, or right to the country they want to give it to, because who cares? Who looks into it at all? Within 3 years of the raid, 120 additional shipping operations had been set up in coastal cities throughout Europe. In addition to the refineries in Sicily, hundreds of, quote, heroin kitchens were set up throughout Turkey, including Baskale, half an hour from the border with Iraq. New routes were opened throughout the Balkans, along with hotels, restaurants, and brothels to accommodate the smugglers. Rural hovels such as Lice, or spelled like lice, Van, and Gaziantep gave rise to smugglers' nests and sudden prosperity. So literally, like building up, they're like gentrifying areas just with all this drug trafficking. Heroin had become a $400 billion business with 200 million users throughout the world. Yeah, it's very lucrative. It's like an addictive product. It's crazy. The CIA's share of this business was used to finance the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the guerrilla forces in Angola, the Contras in Nicaragua, the puppet regimes in South America, and the death squads in El Salvador. Definitely save this. That's crazy. I wonder if I can like highlight stuff. So I'm just gonna try that out. Paul E. Hellowell's brainstorm had produced an intelligence agency with seemingly limitless funds for seemingly endless operations. Yeah, that remember this all goes back to Paul E. Hellowell and Chiang Kai-shek learning the drug trade from them, learning how to fund military operations with heroin sale. Drug boom is the next section here. The Golden Triangle was now producing 80% of the world's opium supply. At the end of 1982, the DEA had evidence of over 40 heroin syndicates and 200 heroin laboratories operating in Pakistan. The CIA deposited a large share of its profits from these operations into the Shakarchi Trading Company in Lebanon, which served not only as a convenient laundry, but also as a shipping firm that delivered 8.5-ton shipments of choice brown product to the Gambino crime syndicate in New York. In keeping with the policy of false flags, the sharp rise in heroin production was blamed on the Soviet generals in Kabul. Quote, the regime maintains an absolute indifference to any measures to control poppy. This is Edwin Meese, President Reagan's Attorney General, said during a visit to Islamabad. Quote, we strongly believe that there is actually encouragement, at least tactically, over growing poppy. So the CIA is accusing the Soviets of encouraging Afghani militants to grow poppy, when in fact they are the ones funding, trading it, laundering it. Wild stuff. At every turn they have done this. They accused China back like before this, they accused China again now of the fentanyl stuff. The increased flow of heroin impacted all regions of the world, including Pakistan. Before the CIA program, there were fewer than 5,000 heroin users in Pakistan. At the end of the Soviet Afghanistan war, there were 1.6 million heroin addicts. Hmm. So the next section here is Arkansas Narco Bank. But the principal laundry for the new heroin network remained the BCCI, which continued to retain its primary offices in London and Karachi. That's crazy because I thought the BCCI was a whole. I lost track of that acronym. There's so many. There also actually is a legend of acronyms in here. There's a whole table of it. I can. I mean, the link is in the description. But the BCCI, which continued to retain its primary offices in London and Karachi, James R. Bath, a CIA associate and the business partner of George W. Bush, remained a primary director. Bert Lance, an American businessman who served as the director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Carter, emerged in 1981 as a key BCCI consultant, along with Arkansas-based power broker Jackson Stevens. In accordance with the wishes of William Casey, the CIA director under President Reagan, the BCCI stood alone, financially independent, and free from congressional scrutiny. Thanks to Lance and Stevens, Western Arkansas suddenly became a hub of international drug smuggling. Wild. Cocaine was being smuggled into the small airport in Mena by CIA assets, including pilot Barry Seal. These assets also transported to Mena huge bales of cash, which was laundered by BCCI's first American bank. So I guess Mena is a place in Arkansas. It's just some probably random place out there that now becomes a hub for drug trafficking, billions and billions of dollars, bunch of CIA and intelligence activity. Fort Bragg cartel comes to mind. That's the thing that's in the news lately. First American was a Washington, D.C. financial institution that had been acquired for BCCI by former Secretary of Defense Clark M. Gifford. The cash came from the Gambino crime family, which was shelling out $50 million for each shipment. So blocked by national security is the next section here. The laundering at First American was conducted in conjunction with Wortham Bank, a financial institution owned by Jackson Stevens, and the Arkansas Development Finance Authority, a state agency that had been set up by Governor Bill Clinton. Oh man, if I could do an impression, that would come in handy right now. It's funny that he shows up in this, but also, could explain a lot. Do good things for the CIA, you get high places. You can even get into the Vatican. Stevens had been a major donor to Clinton's 1982 gubernatorial campaign, and Worthern had provided the candidate with a $3.5 million line of credit. The BCCI's front in the DC bank was Kamal Adham, who, according to the Kerry Committee report, operated as, quote, the CIA's principal liaison for the entire Middle East from the mid 1960s throughout 1979, or through 1979. In his attempt to probe First American, CBS correspondent Bill Planty complained that there was, quote, a trail of tens of millions of dollars in cocaine profits from Mena, Arkansas, and we don't know where it leads. It is a trail blocked by the National Security Council. Wild. Wild shit. Yeah, you can't know where this corrupt money goes because it's a matter of national security. Wild that they can even say that, and then people don't, I don't know, do something. The next section here is Holy See Secrets. Sorry. By 1985, BCCI had become an international $23 billion operation. Through it, the CIA had shelled out more than $83 million to Licio Gelli for Operation Gladio and the October Surprise. From it, the agency provided infusions of, quote, discretionary cash to the Vatican shell companies, including Erin, that's ERIN, Erin SA. Strange to say, some of this money ended up in the offices of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. Whip, 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 whip. Mysteries surrounding the surrounding BCCI began to abound. Millions of dollars in cash transfers arrived each day from the various branches of this notorious bank, flowing into Manlon, a firm with offices in London, Bombay, and Luxembourg, about which scant information exists. Additional funds came from Banco Ambrosiano and the Atlanta branch of the Banca Nacional de Lavoro. Manlon's corporate purpose, according to documents filed with England's Companies House, was, quote, to act as confirming agents in the sale of goods of all kinds. The existing records of the shadowy organization show that it was used to post large financial credits to the IOR and an association of Catholic priests in Chicago, the hometown of Archbishop Marcinkus. Chicago's in the news today because Trump is saying he's going to take over that city next. He's going to just like start deporting American citizens from there. Special deliveries, the next section here. Arthur Hartman, another director of BCCI, was an old hat in the spy game, having worked for decades with British and Saudi intelligence. Hartman also served as the president of the Rothschild Bank of Zurich. In June 1982, Hartman's bank in Zurich received a morning delivery from BCCI, a suitcase stuffed with $21 million in cash. The money was to be used for the murder of Roberto Calvi. It just gets crazier and crazier. Like every page is just the wildest stuff. The most like scandalous of scandals you could possibly read about. Um, yeah, it's wild just to like have this level of corruption. It's in books. Just it's well sourced, like I keep saying, and people are just like worried about elections. It's like, what are you guys even talking about? Chapter 18: Blackfriars Bridge. The priests will be the end of us. They believe in any case that if someone dies, their soul lives on, so it's not such a bad thing. This is Roberto Calvi to his daughter Anna, April 1982, quoted in Rupert Cornwell's God's Banker. The decision to kill Calvi was not taken lightly. The CIA had tried to resolve the Ambrosiano affair by providing Francesco Pazienza as the banker's new, quote, international consultant. The move displayed the agency's determination to resolve the Ambrosiano imbroglio. Very clever, Paul. Very clever. Few individuals were of more vital importance to Gladio than Pazienza, and no one was more wired to the operation's power brokers. A trained physician, Pazienza had abandoned his medical profession to serve Operation Gladio. He was dispatched to serve SISMI. Oh, that's what I confused with the BCCI. So that's the Italian agency. SISMI. He was dispatched to serve SISMI, General Santovito, by former NATO commander and Secretary of State Alexander Haig. Oh, and former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Cool. Cool, cool, cool. A leading member of P2, he met regularly with Licio Gelli and was later named as a co-conspirator in the Bologna bombing. Since 1978, he had worked closely with Henry Arsan at Stybum, arranging the sale of a fleet of warships to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Pazienza was also a man of honor, with filial ties to Pippo Callo and Salvatore Inzerillo, and, by extension, to the Gambino family in the United States. Thanks to his friendship with Michael Ledeen, Pazienza became deeply involved in U.S. political affairs, including the implementation of Billygate, a plot connecting President Carter's brother with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Wild. How have I never heard of this before? Billygate? They're trying to connect Jimmy Carter's brother Billy, the PFLP. Wild stuff. a group that sought the destruction of Israel. I mean, President Reagan was duly impressed with Pazienza's talents. In the diplomatic interregnum created by Reagan's removal of Richard Gardner as the U.S. ambassador to Italy, Pazienza and Ledeen received the federal fiat to handle relations between the U.S. and Italian governments. In March 1981, Pazienza began to devise a plan to plug the gaping $1.7 billion hole within Banco Ambrosiano that had been created by, quote, loans to the Vatican's shell companies. Remember, this was how they were creating wealth for themselves. They were just like lending money to shell companies, creating the money that was to be lended, creating the money that like they weren't paying back any interest. So just profit hand over fist. Like they're just making up money. Um, and then they ended up doing this to the tune of, I guess, $1.75 billion. Through his CIA contacts, he arranged for two American investors, presumably David Rockefeller and Robert Armau, that's ARMAO, Armau, uh, three Saudi businessmen, and two banks to pay $1.2 billion for the nine shell companies that now held nearly 16% of Ambrosiano's stock. Hmm. It seems like it's just like basically it's like a settlement to pay 1.2 billion for the 1.75 billion asset or debt. So Calvi caged is the next section. 7 days after John Paul II was shot, Calvi was arrested for the illegal transfer of funds out of the country and locked up in Lodi prison, 20 minutes south of Milan. As soon as this happened, Calvi's family contacted Archbishop Marcinkus to seek his help in springing the banker from his cell. Marcinkus responded to their pleas by saying, quote, if the IOR accepts any responsibility, it will not only be the Vatican's image that will suffer, you'll lose as well, for our problems are your problems too. That sounds like when the people try to defend Israel and they're like, well, you have to protect Israel, otherwise the United States will fall. It's like, okay, two cakes. Prison was the worst experience of Calvi's life. Painfully introverted, he was obsessive in his behavior and fastidious in his personal care. His cellmates passed their time playing cards and listening to rock and roll on the radio. I mean, make prison sound like it's not so bad. Calvi could neither sleep nor use the toilet in full view of the others. A visitor found him, quote, bloated and completely submissive, meekly obeying the taunting prison guards, and at the brink of physical and mental exhaustion. Bitch made. On July 3rd, when questioned by the Milanese magistrates, Calvi broke into tears, quote, I am just the lowest of the low, he sobbed. I am just a dog who serves others. The magistrates asked, then who commands you? Who is the who's the proprietary of the bank? Collecting himself, Calvi said, quote, I can't tell you anymore. On July 7th, when the Italian government charged Sindona with the murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli, Calvi swallowed a quantity of barbiturates and slashed his wrist. Coming to consciousness in the prison infirmary, he said that he had acted in a moment of, quote, lucid depression. On July 29th, Calvi was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment and a fine of 16 billion lira. His lawyer filed an appeal and he was freed on bail. Within a week, he returned to his position as Ambrosiano's chairman. Okay, okay. A letter of patronage is the next section here. So it makes me wonder, does he end up going to prison? How much of that sentence does he serve? Does he die in prison? So a letter of patronage. Calvi was becoming increasingly desperate. The shareholders kept insisting on some proof that the 8 shell companies that had been established in Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and Panama were properties of the Holy See. By August 1st, Calvi had no choice save to appear before Archbishop Marcinkus with hat in hand. The affair was about to explode unless he could present some assurance to the Guardia di Finanza that the 8 companies which had drained Banco Ambrosiano of all its cash reserves were in fact legitimate Vatican concerns. Marcinkus realized that some action had to be taken to ward off financial disaster, and he came up with a course of action that represented one of the greatest acts of fraud in ecclesiastical history. He issued a, quote, letter of patronage, stating that the dummy firms were legitimate financial organizations whose purposes and financial obligations were known, secured, and approved by Holy Mother Church. The letter, dated September 1st, 1981, was written on Vatican letterhead. It read as follows: Gentlemen, this is to confirm that we directly or indirectly control the following entries: Manic S.A., Luxembourg Astrofin S.A., Panama Nord Europe Establishment, Liechtenstein United Trading Corporation, Panama Aaron S.A., Panama Bellatrix S.A., Panama Belrose S.A., Panama Starfield SA, Panama. We also confirm our awareness of their indebtedness towards yourselves as of June 10th, 1981, as per the attached statement of accounts. And then it's footnoted. So the attached accounts showed, quote, indebtedness to the Lima branch of Banco Ambrosiano for a loan for $907 million. The letter was signed by Archbishop Marcinkus along with his administrative assistants Luigi Manini and Pellegrino Distrobel. To compound the fraud, Calvi presented Marcinkus with a letter of his own. This one stating that the Vatican Bank, quote, would entail no liabilities or, quote, suffer no future damage or loss from its involvement with the 8 companies. Wow. Cool. So yeah, again, just like I guess creating legitimacy. You just write a letter, and these things now become legitimate companies that the Vatican owns and controls. And I guess if you admit it, it's all good. Let's see how it plays out for him. So I'm going to bookmark this one here. I'm going to switch over to the Western Marxism book. All right, so again, this is Western Marxism by Domenico Losurdo, translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill. So then, that's how it starts off. So then, two Marxisms are delineated according to two different temporalities: the future in action and the beginning of the near future for Eastern Marxism, the more advanced stage of the near future, and the remote and utopian futures for Western Marxism. It is a problem glimpsed by Marx and Engels. Really, they foresaw this. They provide, not by accident, two definitions of communism. The first puts it off to the remote future, sometimes read in a utopian way, a society that has left behind the antagonisms of class and, quote, prehistory as such. Quite different are the vision and the temporality that emerge in a celebrated section of, quote, or of the German ideology. Quote, we call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. I saw shout out to the Revolutionary Left page on Instagram. That's Comrade Reina, who is who's been on a tear lately with like decent Marxist posts, like about like theory, like what do you call it? Like effort posts is the word I'm looking for. So like you know, where you take screenshots or like cite stuff from Marxist.org, relevant, thinkers on Twitter or whatever. But she's been saying the same kind of thing, that like people have this idea that Marxism or communism is stateless, classless, moneyless society. And it's like Marx and Engels, I don't think ever said that, but it is the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. But going on here, or that which emerges from the conclusion of the Communist Manifesto. Quote, in short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In these two passages cited here, it is as if we had thrown up a bridge between the two different temporalities. When this task is ignored or disdained, it is not long before the superficialities and conceits show up. The conceits show up, which love to contrast the poetry of the remote future to the prospect of the long-term prose of immediate tasks. Yeah, I don't know if that's what he's saying here, but it does remind me of, again, all the pontificating that people do online in any space, like in public. Like they'll do it in real life too. Like it's not like people who are in meetings don't like to fucking again circle jerk about their ideal communist society and what they support or don't support. It's like you're not getting that because you're still supporting imperialism materially. There is nothing easier and more idle than this operation. Even the most intellectually and morally mediocre have no difficulty in evoking the future of the quote free development of all of the manifesto to condemn or discredit the political power born of the revolution in any determinate geopolitical situation, called on to confront the dangers that threaten it. The concrete history of the new post-revolutionary society, which seeks to develop itself among the tentative contradictions, difficulties, and errors of every kind, is defined en bloc as a degeneration and betrayal of the real movement in the name of the remote and utopian futures, an attitude foreign to Marx and Engels, and which deprives Marxism of any real emancipatory project. Yeah, that's the other negative function of it. It's like daydreaming about your utopian, uh, perfect socialist society keeps people from doing any of the actual things that would bring about a real socialist future. Take such an attitude means arbitrarily amputating the plural temporalities that characterize the revolutionary project of Marx and Engels. It means a temporal amputation, sorry, A temporal amputation that is simultaneously spatial. It concentrates exclusively on the remote future, read in a utopian vein, and leads to the exclusion of the vast majority of the world and humanity that has begun to take the first steps toward modernity and has sometimes even stopped at its threshold. And so the essential condition for the rebirth of Marxism in the West is the transcendence of this temporal and spatial amputation of the revolutionary project it has carried out. And again, it's not like a coincidence that the fucking daydreaming about the utopian socialist future and then support for actual existing socialist projects or historical ones, it's like they're mutually exclusive. It's like the same people who are daydreaming and utopian, again, don't support the existing ones that have actually and continue to threaten imperialism. And I don't think that's a coincidence. The Venn diagram is two circles that don't touch. So we're on to section 4 or chapter 4. Because it's divided into three, I guess, larger sections that have, I guess, numbered sections in them. So I don't have to call that a chapter. But anyway, restoring the relationship with the world anti-colonial revolution. Transcending the unfortunate temporal and spatial amputation of Marxism will not be possible if Marxists in the West do not restore their relationship with the world, with the world anti-colonial revolution, which is mostly led by communist parties and which was the principal question of the 20th century and continues to play an essential role in the century we have entered for some years now. Yeah, should not be controversial. To restore this relationship means fully reintroducing the colonial question to the historical account of the 20th century and 20th century Marxism. When Coletti broke definitively with Marxism, he amused himself by noting that he had reached a conclusion not unlike where Althusser ended up. Even for the latter, failure was the legacy of the communist movement. The French philosopher bitterly observed that nowhere did the process of the quote withering away of the revolutionary state promised by the Bolsheviks take place. Indeed, added the triumphant Italian philosopher, the communists were never able in any way to solve the problem of limitations on power, contrary to what happened in the liberal West. Yeah, bold claim, big if true. Imagine, I mean, especially in hindsight, 30 years after the end of history shit and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, um, imagine trying to assert that the West has been more successful at limiting power of tyrants or, trying to wither away the state, even, other than for, like, in the libertarian capitalist sense. It is an account that can be more usefully contrasted with one by a philosopher who is not a follower of Marxism or communism, but a sharp critic, even an attentive and respectful one, of both movements. As to the representation of the Cold War as a conflict between the free world on one side and despotism and totalitarianism on the other, he objected, quote, Western liberalism rests upon the forced labor of the colonies in 20 wars. Tim, who said this? Uh, It lacks credibility and, quote, any apology for democratic regimes which is silent about their violent intervention in the rest of the world, or juggles the records to make it appear a special case, can only serve to mask the problem of capitalism. Yeah, bars. And so, quote, the right to defend the values of liberty and conscience is ours only if we are sure in doing so that we do not serve the interests of imperialism or become associated with its mystifications. Hmm. Hold on, sorry, I gotta go back and see. I guess they're not naming this person yet. They have not named who this philosopher is, so let's see what. I guess I'll just continue on. To conclude with this first point, if in our accounts of the 20th century history we avoid myopia and Eurocentric arrogance, we must recognize the essential contribution made by communism to the overthrow of the world colonialist slavery system. The merciless white supremacy was denounced by a few courageous people as, quote, an all-absorbing autocracy of race. This regime, which reminds us of the Third Reich, existed worldwide and constituted the principal target of the movement born of the October Revolution. Even if it has assumed new forms with respect to the past, the struggle between anti-colonialism and colonialism and neocolonialism has not ceased. It is not by accident that, following its triumph in the Cold War, the West celebrated it not only a the West celebrated as not only a defeat inflicted on communism, but also on third worldism, and as the premise for its coveted return of colonialism and even imperialism. That enthusiasm and euphoria were indeed a, were indeed of brief duration. But this has not led to any real ideological and political rethinking. Yeah, I think that's actually a really crucial point. It was just saying, like, 30 years after, do we feel like that has been more of a success for humanity? That communism supposedly, quote unquote, collapsed or failed or whatever? Or do we feel like that's still even the case when you watch China's development? Indeed, the deprecations and cries of alarm for the sundown of the West, or for its relative weakening and weakening of its leading country, remind us of the analogous phenomenon at the beginning of the 20th century, when extraordinarily popular authors on both sides of the Atlantic denounced the mortal peril of the quote rising tide of people of color that loomed over the quote loomed over quote world white supremacy. Yeah. So a century ago, you could just be outspoken about how you supported white supremacy, you supported imperialism, and it was good. And now even the biggest proponents, they have to mask it, like, a little bit. They have to, like, call it something else. The liberal world order, they call it. They just have to defend the West. Certainly, in our own time, the language has changed. There is no longer a direct reference to races and racial hierarchies. This change is a sign of the success of the anti-colonial revolution in the 20th century. And again, one that liberalism takes credit for. They act like just slow, steady liberalism made this happen, as opposed to, like, the world anti-colonial revolution forced that change. On another note, however, the fresh homages to colonialism and even to imperialism and the persistent celebration of the West, no longer of the white race, as the exclusive site of authentic civilization and of the highest moral values, are signs that the anti colonial revolution has not yet reached its conclusion. And so, Marxists in the West must restore their relationship with the world anti colonial revolution. Yeah, yeah, that really is like the only solution. It is right to expect that they will look with sympathy not only at a people like the Palestinians, who are still forced to struggle against a classic kind of colonialism, but also at countries that have behind them an anti-colonialist revolution that are now seeking with difficulty their own way, being cautious in particular to not fall into a semi-colonial condition of economic and technological dependence. It is not a question of uncritically accepting the positions taken by these countries. It is enough to take into account once more the viewpoint of Merleau-Ponty, quote, an aggressive liberalism exists that is a dogma and and the ideology of war. Sorry. It can be recognized by its love of the empyrean of principles, its failure to mention the geographical and historical circumstances to which it owes its birth, and its abstract judgments of political systems without regard for the specific conditions under which they develop. If the French philosopher must be considered indulgent toward Western Marxism, we can reflect on some of Machiavelli's considerations regarding the grave difficulties that inevitably block the path of those building quote new orders. Hmm. So I suppose that philosopher that he was like mentioning, but not by name, was Merleau-Ponty. So he was spitting. I guess even though he's cited here as one of the people who was sympathetic to Western Marxism, hate to see it. We can even turn to a classic figure of liberalism, who is one of the founding fathers of the United States. In Alexander Hamilton, we read that in his geez, Hamilton really? I feel like I'm just makes me think of the play. Like, what's the guy? I can't think of the dude's name. It'll come to me. In Alexander Hamilton, we read that in a situation of geographic insecurity, it is not possible to govern by law and through the limitation of power, and that faced with, quote, external attack and internal convulsions, even a liberal country has recourse to power, quote, without limitation and without constitutional shackles. Yeah, that has happened like at every turn. When the U.S. has felt itself threatened or has actually been at war, the Constitution has not mattered one bit. Let's see. Yeah, I forgot. Yeah, I'll do this one for like another 5 or some minutes. Third, restoring the relationship with the world anti colonial revolution means taking into account that it is not a matter of respect for the sacred history of political and social emancipation, so much as the concrete form assumed by that history in the 20th and 21st centuries. It has been recognized, even by acclaimed scholars in Western countries, that thanks to the prodigious economic and technological development of China, defined as the most important event of the last 500 years, the Columbian era has come to an end, the era during which, in the words of Adam Smith, quote, the superiority of forces resulted so greatly to the benefit of the Europeans that they could commit all sorts of injustice. Hmm. Well, even he was saying that. To the detriment of other peoples, The error which Hitler, the most fanatical champion of white and Western supremacy, tried by every means to perpetuate. The anti-colonial revolution and the destruction of the world colonialist slavery system, which which must still be brought to an end, put into a new and unexpected framework the problem of the construction of a post-capitalist society. To consider extraneous to the Marxist project of political and social emancipation, the history that developed from the October Revolution and that saw at its epicenter the East, means assuming the attitude Marx mocked from his youth. It is from quote real struggles, he observed, that revolutionary criticism starts. Hmm. Quote, then we shall confront the world not as doctrinaires with a new principle. Here is the truth, bow down before it. We develop new principles for the world out of its own principles. We do not say to the world, stop fighting, your struggle is of no account. We want to shout the true slogan of struggle at you. We only show the world what it is fighting for. This approach toward every doctrinaire attitude is the precondition for the rebirth of Marxism in the West. Yeah, wild. Did he actually? Man, Marx said all those. It all. He sounds like he's like dealing with the exact internet bickering that we all see every day. Like the way he's describing it there, it sounds like it is not 200 years old shit at all. It's wild. It sounds just like, yeah, it's very humble. So his next section is section 5, the lessons of Hegel and the rebirth of Marxism in the West. It is a philosophical problem as well as a political one. There is a need to assimilate the great lesson by which, quote, philosophy is one's own time apprehended through thought. Hmm. Is that something Hegel said? That's pretty cool. It's very clever. Not by chance, the author of this definition, as his biographer notes, quote, was used to reading an immense number of newspapers, something that in general only a statesman can do. And so, quote, he could always have at hand to support his theses an enormous mass of factual data. It is a testimony that sheds much light on a study of the great philosopher. In evidence are the classics of philosophy and the ideas and German and international press. Sorry. In evidence are the classics of philosophy and ideas and German and international press clippings. Okay, sorry, having trouble today, you guys. The philosophical system is elaborated through an incessant confrontation with his own times. We accurately inquire into political events without ever flattening out their immediacy. We investigate the meaning of the logic and epistemology of categories that refer to the main actors of political struggle, or that are implicit in their discourse. The single event is inserted into a long term perspective. Constrained as he was to measure himself against the great texts of the philosophic tradition, his political passion, manifested by voracious newspaper reading, undergoes a process of decanting and gains historical and theoretical depth. Politics, logic, epistemology, and history all closely intersect. Hmm. Marx's Marx's writing desk is no different, although Hegel stands out first among the classics. The fitting together of events with the impulse to connect them closely with theory and praxis impeded, however, the philosopher and revolutionary from elaborating a complete philosophical system of his own and from completing that project, according to Engels, who reports that he worked long on a summary of dialectics, perhaps to revise Hegel's science of logic. Now the thesis that to philosophize is to conceptually apprehend one's own time has acquired an additional meaning. Reading one's own time is no longer only a question of conceptualizing and structuring a rigorous categorical apparatus. It is also to identify the presence of a determinate historical moment, with its contradictions and its conflicts, also in the seemingly most quote, abstract conceptualizations and philosophical systems. Hmm. I'm going to bookmark this one here. But yeah, as always, the Western Marxism book is dead on when it like describes the Western versus Eastern Marxists, and in its descriptions and its prescriptions for what should be done. It is always dead on. But now I'm going to switch over to The Soviets Expected It by Louise Strong. So, continuing here. Within 6 months after the coming of the Red Army, oil fields in western Ukraine that had been idle for years were back in production. The unemployed in Lvov were getting work at a rate of 1 or 200 a day. A year after the occupation, Western Ukraine reported that 978 industrial plants that had been idle had been reopened, and 500 new ones had been built. Hundreds of new school buildings were constructed, and hundreds of hospitals. An invasion of music followed the Red Army invasion. Led by opera artists of Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Byelorussia, the new territories rapidly acquired bands, orchestras, musical schools, and theaters of their own. They had less than 2 years' glimpse of their new national equality and progress. In those 2 years, they gained a hope and an organization which strikes today at the German line in Eastern Europe in the fury of a people's war. There is no fury greater than that of people who, after centuries of oppression, have glimpsed freedom for a little while. Hmm, I do like that. I'm just going to read that again. There is no fury greater than that of people who, after centuries of oppression, have glimpsed freedom for a little while. Yeah. Can you imagine? So we're on to chapter 11 here, building the buffer belt. The march of the Red Army into Poland had immediate repercussions in all states along the Soviets' European border. The first reaction seems to have been one of amazement tempered by relief. Correspondents from Hungary and Ruthenia all noted this amazement. They said that, quote, respect for Russia had been greatly increased, and that there was no question that the peasants preferred Russians to the Germans along their border. In Romania, it was noted that the March of the Red Army had probably prevented violent Nazi uprisings intended to turn that country over to the German troops. Yeah, remember that was like a tactic they were talking about was like the fifth column thing was like the German, the Nazis would like infiltrate uh, mostly high levels, but various levels of the government of the country they were trying to take over, and then they would concoct and enact some plan, uh, like a not even a soft coup, just a coup, and take over that country like pretty quickly. It would be like an administrative military coup, basically. A second effect of the march was the swift intensification of class cleavage in all these states. All of them had dictator governments, which had kept the people uninformed about the Soviet Union. But nothing could stop the news that the peasants of East Poland, with Soviet approval, were taking the landlord's land. This stirred new hopes among the poor and landless rural populations, and also, of course, increased the anti Soviet attitude of the upper classes. A secret delegation from Lithuanian ruling circles went to Berlin to invite Hitler's direct intervention. The mere suspicion of its purpose caused such outcry among the Lithuanian people that it was repudiated by the Lithuanian government, especially as Hitler was not yet ready to send troops. Moscow's next moves were directed towards strengthening her European frontier by military alliances with neighboring Baltic states. The way was prepared by the Soviet refusal of the boundary line which Hitler first offered in Poland, and which would have given to the Soviets territory in quote, ethnic Poland, as far as Warsaw. This refusal not only preserved Soviet neutrality in the eyes of Britain, but helped convince East European powers that the Soviets were not only strong but just. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, what? So Hitler's just getting too greedy? I guess he's just like showing that he's Hitler. He's literally Hitler. Dude is literally Hitler. Next, the Soviets presented Lithuania with her ancient capital, Vilna, seized 20 years earlier by the Poles. Hmm. Yeah, I remember seeing this meme circling just last week. It was like the cat where it's like looking down and it says, "Read history of Poland, look inside history of Lithuania." I didn't really get it, but I guess that makes it make a little more sense. It was an important gift, being twice the size of the present capital, Kaunas. In its 550,000 population, increased Lithuania's total population by 20%. Molotov later stated that it was not given because Vilna had a Lithuanian population. After 20 years of Polish domination, most of Vilna's inhabitants were Poles and Jews. Quote, the Soviet government took into consideration the historic past and the national aspirations of the Lithuanian people. In other words, the gift was made not for the sake of Vilna, which didn't particularly want to be transferred, but for the psychological effect on the Lithuanians. Having prepared for friendly intercourse by these actions, the Soviets next combined invitation with pressure. They seized the incident. They seized the incident of the escape of an interned Polish submarine from an Estonian port and the subsequent torpedoing of a Soviet ship to invite the Estonian foreign minister to Moscow to discuss a mutual alliance. He went and signed on the dotted line. Similar invitations were issued to Latvia and Lithuania with similar results. Hmm, cool. Just being like cool headed being cool cucumbers as opposed to the literal Nazis. Guess it works. By October 10th, 1939, less than a month after the Red Army marched into Poland, these three Baltic states, which had always been highways for a military invasion of the Soviet Union, had military alliances with the USSR. Oh yeah, good strategy, comrades. Quote, every day it becomes clearer that Russia is constructing a great defense barrier from the Baltic to the Black Sea, wrote an American commentator. Most of the British and American press greeted these first Baltic moves of the USSR with the outcry of denunciation that had been habitual in mentioning Soviet moves. The Baltic governments themselves, after the first plunge, seem to have found the swimming not too chilly. They noted realistically that they formerly had to be acceptable to the British or Germans to get loans or commerce, and now they had to be acceptable to the Soviets. They added that the Soviets, quote, could have demanded anything up to annexation and complete Sovietization of their countries, and neither Germany nor the Allies could have stopped it. Their internal organization was no more affected by the new alliance than the governments in South America are affected by the acquisition of naval bases by the United States. The countries were not even required to join in the defense. And are they defending? Was no more affected by the new alliance than the governments in South America are affected by the acquisition of naval bases by the United States. I mean, I feel like those South American countries are very affected by that. Is that like sarcastic or ironic here? Anyway, the countries were not even required to join in the defense of the USSR unless the attack upon it came directly across their territory. Baltic diplomats and press therefore commented on the shrewdness and reasonableness of Moscow and on the expected trade advantages. They much resented the term, quote, vassal applied to them by the Anglo American press. I mean, it doesn't seem like they really are. This seems like it's, again, in the communist tradition, more of like win win rather than like, you know, vassal kind of relationship. A powerful chain of naval bases originally constructed by Peter the Great thus came under Soviet control. Fully as important as the naval bases was the removal of about half a million Germans from the Baltic states. Some of them had been in the Baltic for centuries, but most of them had come from the Polish corridor when it was taken from Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. All of them were highly conscious of themselves as a superior race. They formed the upper class in the Baltic states. For centuries, they had been the outpost of German imperialism eastward. They owned the big estates and dominated the industries. At the time of the Russian Revolution, much of the native population sided with the Bolsheviks. It was the Baltic Germans who overthrew the local and red governments, calling the troops of the Kaiser to their aid. The removal of these Baltic Germans by Soviet pressure on Hitler was, sorry, on Hitler's scattered, sorry, let me just try that again. The removal of these Baltic Germans by Soviet pressure on Hitler scattered what was for the USSR the most dangerous Nazi fifth column anywhere in Europe. Baltic newspapers expressed regret mingled with pleasure at their going, and remarked that it gave the natives a chance at the better paid jobs. Funny. It's funny. So yeah, I mean, says a lot about the Balkans. It's wild. Like in my research into like vanguard parties, like what countries they've existed in, like what countries have had successful ones, which ones have had failed ones. There's been a lot. There's been quite a few. There's been dozens upon dozens. But then when you look at the ones in the Baltics, like if you just research it at all, it's like yeah, there've been right wing style vanguard parties. They're like literally fascist parties or neo fascist parties, and it's like damn, not a good look, you guys. But continuing here, having secured herself against surprise attack via the southern Baltic by shrewd timing, with practically no effort, Moscow next approached Finland, which controls the gateway from the north. Finland was in a position to nullify most of the previous gains. For the Finnish shores, control for 100 miles the sea approach to Leningrad, while the Finnish frontier was only 20 miles from that city, within gunshot range. Hmm. During the wars of intervention from 1918 through 1921, Finland had been the country through which was launched the first and also last attack on the USSR. Quote, the best approach to Petrograd is from the Baltic, and the shortest and easiest route is through Finland. Finland is the key to Petrograd, and Petrograd is the key to Moscow, said the London Times, promoting the intervention of those days. Finland, or rather the Finnish ruling circles, and especially Baron Karl von Mannerheim, had a long history of conflict with the Soviets. There are two Finlands. Class lines here have always been unusually bitter, being accentuated by race. The upper class consists of descendants of Swedes who once ruled the land, and who, like the Germans of the southern Baltic states, disdained until recently even to speak the language of the natives. The common people are an Asiatic race who centuries ago became the football of wars between the Swedish and Russian empires. The Finnish common people had a hunger for democracy as strong as any in the world. They were the first people in the world to elect a parliament with a socialist majority. This was at the 1916 elections and was a wartime protest against the Russian Tsar. That's cool. That gives me a much better impression of Finland, because I had thought that like they had just always sided with the Nazis. So good to see them actually like uh, you know doing some basic stuff, siding with the socialists. Good afternoon, people in the chat. What's up, Royalty Company and Tim Price? Good to see you guys. Finnish independence was a gift from the Bolshevik Revolution. Any schoolteacher in present-day Finland would lose her job if she mentioned this incontrovertible historical fact. When Kerensky came to power, Finland applied for independence. The Kerensky government refused. Neither Britain, France, America, nor any foreign power approved of Finland's independence in those days. Only the Bolsheviks approved. On motion of Joseph Stalin, who said that, quote, since the Finnish people, through their representatives, definitively demand that their independence be recognized, the proletarian state cannot but meet the demand of the people of Finland. Finland's independence was confirmed by Soviet Russia on January 4th, 1918. This early democratically elected Finland was quickly suppressed. Baron Karl von Mannerheim, a Tsarist general, called in German troops to overthrow the government. After this victory, he won the title Butcher by his slaughter of some 40,000 of the Finnish working class and put so many more of them in concentration camps that the industries couldn't run for want of workers. He dominated the country through his civil guards, a privately organized army with government subsidy, the first army of the fascist type in Europe. From that time on, despite many bitter struggles, Finland never got back its democracy. Okay, so that's why we have that impression of Finland siding with the Nazis, is because the bad guys just won. They just like oppressed enough of the people, murdered tens of thousands of them, essentially colonized them. And that's why Finland became known as like the Nazi collaborator country. It's a damn shame. You hate to see it. More than half of the farmers possessed a total of less than 4% of the farmland. Trade union membership, which in 1919 was 161,000, was only 90,000 in 1939. Finland's constitution made the president independent of the Diet, or the Diet, with the right to dissolve it, veto its decisions, and promulgate legislation without the Diet. Citizens' rights must be restricted, quote, in time of war or under any other circumstances. Yeah. Whatever democracy the Constitution permitted was nullified by the civil guard. What concerned the Soviet Union was not Finland's internal organization, but the fact that for 20 years the ruling class of Finland was a center of international actions against the Soviets. Helsinki vied with Riga as chief source of anti-Soviet forged documents and the chief entry port for spies bound for the USSR. Wow, so they had like entire industries of like forged Soviet documents for spies. Crazy shit. And so apparently Riga and Helsinki are the two main hubs. Armaments were supplied to Finland by any nation that felt in an anti-Soviet mood. In the early days, the Mannerheim Line was built under British direction. It was a system of offensive defensive forts, well calculated to shield a large force attacking Leningrad. Later, Finland's aerodromes were built by the Nazis, who by that time had become the center of the anti-Soviet forces. So yeah, so it's a win-win relationship for them. I guess you get a bunch of air defenses. Built to accommodate 2,000 planes, while Finland had 150, they were clearly planned as a base for one of the major powers. Baron Mannerheim represented Finland in 1935 at the East Prussia meeting called by Göring to discuss joint plans against the USSR. Finland was therefore known to the Soviet leaders as the most hostile of all the Baltic states. Wow, is Finland considered a Baltic state? Do they consider themselves a Baltic state? Or I always thought they were like a Scandinavian state. Is that what they prefer to be known as? That would say a lot as well. The others had signed up easily. It was known that an alliance with Finland would be the hardest to get, but Moscow had something to offer. The Anglo-German War was ruining Finland's foreign trade and causing a severe depression. Finland wanted trade with the Soviets and the use of Murmansk Railway for access to the outer world. On October 5th, 1939, having signed up the rest of the Eastern Baltic, the Soviet government invited the Finnish government to send a plenipotentiary to Moscow to discuss, quote, pending questions. The result was somewhat startling. The Finnish government, before replying, declared partial mobilization, sent large armed forces to the frontier, closed the stock exchange until further notice, requested women and children to evacuate Helsinki, and appealed to America, quote, for sympathy and moral support. What? The Moscow press expressed ironic irritation over what was considered a government-inspired panic before the USSR had even presented demands. Wild. Yeah, it seems like they literally just like flipped the fuck out on a national scale. Like it's crazy. The Soviet proposals thus heralded did not seem especially alarming when finally made to the Finnish delegation, which arrived in Moscow October 11th under chairmanship of M. Paasikivi, an experienced diplomat. He is experienced. Moscow first proposed an alliance, such as she had with other Baltic states, but almost at once dropped the proposal in view of Finland's clear unwillingness. Yeah, it seems like that's they've made their intentions pretty clear. The Soviets next proposed that both sides agree not to join a military coalition against the other, and that certain exchanges of territory be made for the protection of Leningrad. The Soviets wanted the frontier moved back far enough to take Leningrad out of gunshot from Finland. They did not ask, as some have thought, for the Mannerheim line. They also wanted some small islands that covered Leningrad's sea approach. They offered in return twice as much equally good but less strategic land. Later, they raised the offer. They also asked a 30-year lease of Hango or some other port, or some other point at the entrance to the Gulf of Finland as a naval base. Okay, so it seems like they're being again pretty reasonable. Obviously, I'm going to be sympathetic to the Soviets here, but like it just seems like they are objectively being pretty reasonable about this. I don't know. Premier Kajander of Finland almost at once, October 13th, broadcast a statement that the Soviet demands did not affect the integrity of Finland. A month later, after the USSR had made several concessions, the Finnish government decided that the demands did affect Finland's integrity and broke off, I guess, negotiations. Let's see. Okay, go to this next page. Yeah. Broke off negotiations on November 13th with the cryptic remark that circumstances would decide when and by whom they would be renewed. Okay. What circumstances? What had happened to make the Finnish government change its mind about the nature of the proposals and finally turn them down? A Swedo-Finnish woman of the upper classes whom I met in Rome, thought she knew what had happened. She despised Bolsheviks, Russians generally, and also lower-class Finns as Asiatics. But she reserved her real hate, the kind of hate one has for an equal, for the Finnish Prime Minister and for Prime Minister Chamberlain and President Roosevelt. She thought that, quote, our Paasikivi was a clever man who knows how to handle Russians, and that he had secured in Moscow, quote, a very smart bargain. He had made the Russians increase their offer of territory until Finland stood to get nearly 3-1 by the trade. He had got the Russians to agree that the Hango naval base should be held out not for 30 years, but only for the duration of the Anglo-German War, after which it would come back to Finland fully equipped. Not a bad bargain at all, she said. But Erko was stubborn, and he seems to have had promises from America and Britain. They got us into this, and we are ruined now. Oh yeah, the old internal sabotage by your own countrymen, right? Or it's usually like a race that they accuse. Someday, when the archives of nations are opened, we may know what really happened in that Soviet-Finnish war. The day after negotiations broke down, diplomatic quarters in Washington were saying, according to the New York Times, that the expectation of loans from America, quote, might have influenced Finland into suspending negotiations. It is clear at least that the war was part of a larger setup, and can be understood only in relation to the whole European conflict then going on. That was the time of the quote phony war on the Western Front, when neither Chamberlain, Daladier, nor Hitler really wanted to fight. Hitler was making quote peace offensives. Chamberlain was making quote alliances with states in Eastern Europe, trying to throw the war around Germany via Turkey in the south and the Scandinavian countries in the north. He wanted to get the war into Eastern Europe for three good reasons: to cut Germany's supply line, to get an easier approach than the deadly West Wall offered, and most important of all, to have the war. They put entire pages of blank space in between these pages. Sorry, you guys. uh, and most important of all, to have the war where it could be thrown in either direction against Germany or the USSR. Yeah, of course. Of course, what the West, all the Western countries, all the Western powers always wanted was to be able to use the World War to their advantage against either the Germans or the Soviets that they saw as the threat to their imperial power. In the opinion of many, it was the quote wrong war that had started. Both the American and British press were full of desires to quote switch the war. There is no doubt that there are powerful classes both in France and in Britain which would be more interested in a war against Bolshevik Russia than in a war against Nazi Germany, of course, wrote Lloyd George. Sweden's foreign minister Gunther spilled part of the beans after the Soviet-Finnish War was over in his official explanation on March 17th of what Sweden's position had been. Quote, "The idea of coming to the aid of Finland opened up new vistas to the Allied powers. The deadlock on the Western Front was not popular, and the newspapers of France spoke of the hunt for new battlefields." Moscow certainly thought that the Finnish cabinet leaders were acting, not under instructions from the Finnish parliament, but under secret pressures from America and Britain. The Finnish parliament was not summoned until after the war began. Finnish newspapers that suggested that the Soviet proposals offered a basis for negotiation were suppressed. The Soviet leaders believed the Finnish cabinet intended to keep the border boiling with incidents during the winter, which would lead up to large-scale intervention by stronger powers in the spring. In any event, when the first shooting incident occurred, an alleged shooting by Finnish artillery across the border resulting in Red Army casualties, the Soviets, after a disregarded protest, ordered their troops to march on November 30th, 1939. Finland declared war and appealed for foreign help. President Roosevelt declared a, quote, moral embargo against the Soviets. The League of Nations held a special session to expel the offender. For the rest of the winter, the Anglo-German War was out of the picture. The real European war had moved to Finland, as judged both by government attention and by the press. The storm of denunciation and the campaign of lying, which for 3 months filled the American and British press, was unprecedented in our history. Damn. The press of the USSR gave the conflict far less attention. They treated it not as a large-scale war, but as a military operation by the Leningrad Military District for the defense of Leningrad, on much the same level as the Soviet press had previously treated two border conflicts in the Far East with Japan. In neither case was the Red Army as a whole engaged. The armed forces of the Leningrad District carried the action through. Yep, kind of funny how that works. Again, parallels reminding me of today. All right, well, you guys, I'm going to bookmark this one here. That will conclude it for today. But again, thank you as always for joining me. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I love reading this book. Yeah, it's crazy seeing all this stuff in a whole new light. So many parts of this that you never hear from any other kind of contemporary